My name is Leah Bennett. I'm 41 years old. I've worked as a hospital pharmacist for 16 years, which means my entire professional life is built on one specific habit. When a number doesn't add up, you don't move forward until you've checked it twice. That habit is the only reason I didn't say a single word when my mother stood up at her own retirement party in front of 11 relatives and said, "Derek's getting the real money when I go. Leah will get whatever's left." Which, let's be honest, might not be much once the house needs work. Everyone laughed, softly, the way people laugh at something they've decided is harmless. My mother laughed too, pleased with her own joke. I didn't laugh. I did the thing I do every single day at the pharmacy when two numbers don't match. I said nothing, and I waited until I'd checked it twice in my own head. Because what none of them knew, standing in that backyard with paper plates and a sheet cake that said "Congratulations Sharon" in blue icing, was that the house they were casually discussing giving away in pieces someday had been mine, financially, for the last 11 years. Not legally, not on any deed, but in every way that actually mattered. If you've ever quietly kept something alive that everyone else assumed would just take care of itself, stay with me to the end, because this one has a number in it that's going to change how you think about the word family. Subscribe and drop the word left in the comments right now before we even begin. Let's go back to the beginning, because you need the whole shape of this to understand exactly what that backyard sentence actually cost my mother and exactly what it revealed. I grew up in Fairport, a small town outside Rochester, in a modest three-bedroom colonial on Winslow Street that my parents bought the year I was born. My father, Gerald, worked as a machinist at a local tool and die shop for 34 years. My mother, Sharon, stayed home while my brother Derek and I were young, then went back to work part-time at a dentist's office once we were both in school. It was an ordinary, unremarkable childhood in almost every way. Nobody screamed, nobody hit anybody, the refrigerator was always full. But underneath the ordinary surface, there was a very specific, very consistent arithmetic to how my parents, and especially my mother, allocated their attention. Derek is 2 years older than me. He was a magnetic kid, funny, a little reckless, always at the center of whatever room he was in, the kind of charm that made adults forgive things they wouldn't have forgiven in anyone else. I was quieter. I did well in school without any particular drama, which turned out, over time, to be its own kind of invisibility. My mother used to say, to friends, to relatives, to anyone who asked, "Derek keeps me on my toes. Leah's the easy one." She meant it, I think, as a compliment. It took me most of my adult life to understand what easy actually cost me. That being easy meant being assumed, meant never quite generating the kind of urgent attention that difficulty seems to manufacture out of nothing. Derek dropped out of college after a year and a half, cycled through a handful of jobs. Car sales, a stint managing a gym, a brief and expensive attempt at starting a landscaping business. And each time something fell apart, my parents were there, quietly, with money that was never called a loan, exactly, and never really repaid, exactly. I finished my pharmacy degree on a combination of scholarships and a part-time job at a chain drugstore that had me on my feet 40 hours a week on top of a full course load. My parents came to my graduation. They were proud, genuinely, I believe that. But I don't think either of them ever fully understood what it had actually taken, in the specific, granular way parents sometimes understand a harder child's struggles simply because those struggles get narrated to them in real time, over and over, as emergencies. My father died when I was 28. A heart attack, sudden, in the garage on a Saturday morning, the kind of death that leaves no space for goodbyes or last conversations. Just an ordinary Tuesday's worth of unfinished business. A half-repaired lawnmower, a grocery list on the counter, a life that simply stopped mid-sentence. I want to be honest about how that loss reshaped everything that came after, because it's the actual hinge this entire story turns on. Here's the thing my family, collectively, has never fully discussed out loud, and the thing I only pieced together myself, slowly, over the following year. My father had handled all of the household's finances for 31 years of marriage. My mother, by her own later admission, had no real working knowledge of the mortgage, the insurance, the retirement accounts, any of it. When he died, She was left not just grieving, but functionally illiterate in her own financial life. At 59 years old, in a house with 11 years left on a 30-year mortgage she'd never once looked at directly. I found this out by accident, 9 months after my father's funeral, when I drove up from Rochester for a Sunday visit and found a stack of unopened mail on the kitchen counter. Several envelopes marked in red, the kind of red that mortgage servicers use specifically because they know it gets noticed. I asked my mother about it. She started crying almost immediately, which wasn't like her. My mother is not a woman who cries easily, or often, or in front of her children. She told me she was 4 months behind on the mortgage. She told me she'd been too embarrassed to say anything, to anyone, including Derek, who she said she didn't want to worry. I want you to sit with that phrase for a second, because it becomes important later. She didn't want to worry Derek. She hadn't told her actual struggling, financially precarious, emotionally magnetic son that she was 4 months from losing the house he'd grown up in. She told me instead, because some part of her, the same part, I think, that had always quietly known I was the easy one, understood, correctly, that I was the child who could hold difficult information without falling apart. I sat with her at that kitchen table for close to 3 hours that afternoon. I pulled up the mortgage statement myself on her ancient desktop computer and did the math. The house wasn't in danger of some catastrophic, unrecoverable debt. My father had actually paid it down responsibly for years. But the monthly payment, $1,380, had simply become more than my mother's part-time dental office income and modest widow's benefits could reliably cover, especially once you factored in the property taxes, which had crept upward twice since my father's death. I made a decision that afternoon that I never fully explained to anyone, including, for a long time, my mother herself. I set up an automatic monthly transfer from my own checking account directly into hers. $1,380, timed to land 3 days before the mortgage payment was due, every single month, without fail. I told her it was just to help for a little while until things settle. I never told her it would become 11 years. I don't think either of us, in that moment, fully understood that it would. I want to walk you through why I never told anyone. Not Derek, not extended family, not even fully and directly, my mother herself, beyond that first conversation. Because I think the reasoning matters as much as the fact of it. Part of it was simple practicality. My mother was proud, in the specific way people of her generation often are about money, and I understood, watching her cry at that kitchen table, that turning this into an ongoing, acknowledged arrangement, something discussed, something she had to thank me for every single month, would have cost her something I didn't think was mine to take, so I let it become invisible. I let her mind, over time, settle back into the comfortable belief that things had simply worked out, the way people let themselves believe things worked out when the alternative is confronting how close they came to not working out at all. Part of it, if I'm honest, was also about Derek. I didn't tell him because I knew, with a clarity I didn't love about myself, exactly what would happen if I did. He would either resent it, framing it somehow as me trying to buy status in the family, or he would treat it as evidence that money in this family simply flowed toward problems, which would have only reinforced the exact dynamic that had shaped both of our entire lives. I didn't want to be part of that machinery. I just wanted my mother to keep her house. Over those 11 years, I watched, from a careful distance, as Derek's pattern continued almost exactly as it always had. He borrowed from my mother repeatedly. $5,000 for a car repair that turned into a down payment on a different car entirely, $11,000 toward a sure-thing investment in a friend's brewery that closed within 2 years, a series of smaller amounts for rent gaps between jobs that never quite stabilized. I know these numbers because my mother, in the specific way people confide in the child they've quietly decided can handle difficult information, told me about each one, usually with a soft, apologetic laugh, usually followed by some version of, "You know, Derek." I just can't say no to him. I never fully connected, until much later, exactly what was happening underneath those conversations. My mother wasn't spending money she'd carefully saved. She was spending money that existed in her account, specifically because I put it there every month, timed to arrive 3 days before the mortgage was due, so reliably that she'd stopped tracking it as a distinct, arriving thing at all. It had simply become the baseline hum of an account that never quite ran dry, a baseline she then, in perfect innocence, drew from to rescue her other child. over and over for over a decade. I'm not telling you this to make Derek into a villain. I want to be fair, the way I've tried to be fair through every part of this story. He didn't know. He genuinely, as far as I've ever been able to tell, believed our mother had simply managed reasonably well after our father's death, the way you believe things about a parent's finances when nobody's ever handed you a reason to look closer. But the arithmetic of it, once I finally understood it fully, took my breath away in a way I wasn't prepared for. I had spent, over 11 years, $182,160 keeping my mother's house solvent. And a real, meaningful portion of what remained in that account afterward had gone, month after month, toward quietly funding my brother's mistakes. None of us ever fully aware of the connection. My mother retired from the dental office this past spring, after 26 years, and Derek organized a backyard party to celebrate. Genuinely organized it well. I want to give him that. Rented tables, ordered a cake, invited extended family from 3 states. 11 relatives came, aunts and uncles and cousins. I mostly only saw at exactly this kind of gathering. Everyone gathered under string lights in my mother's backyard. The same backyard my father used to grill in every 4th of July until the year he died. The conversation, as it does at these gatherings, eventually drifted toward the future. My mother's plans now that she was retired, whether she'd stay in the house, what eventually might look like. My Aunt Ruth, my mother's younger sister, asked, gently, innocently, "Have you two ever talked about what happens to the house down the line?" My mother laughed, the easy, comfortable laugh of a woman who genuinely believed she was being lighthearted rather than careless. "Oh, we've talked about it a little. Derek's getting the real money. I've got a bit put aside from your father's pension, and that'll go to him, since he's got more, going on." She gestured vaguely, the way people gesture at things they've decided don't need specifics. "Leah will get whatever's left. Honestly, that'll probably just be the house. And by the time I'm gone, it'll probably need a new roof, and who knows what else. So don't expect much, sweetheart," she said, looking at me, smiling, entirely without malice, entirely without any awareness of what she'd actually just said. Several people laughed, softly, the specific laugh reserved for something everyone's agreed to find charming rather than examine closely. Derek didn't laugh, actually. I noticed that, later, when I thought back through the whole afternoon. He just looked briefly, genuinely uncomfortable, the first flicker I'd seen in years of him actually registering the shape of what our mother had just said. I did the thing I do every day at the pharmacy when 2 numbers don't match. I said nothing. I picked up a stack of paper plates that needed clearing, and I carried them to the trash. And I stood there for a moment longer than clearing plates required, doing the math in my head, checking it twice, the way I always do before I trust a conclusion enough to act on it. The house that would probably just need a new roof was a house I had personally kept out of foreclosure for 11 years. The real money my mother was planning to leave Derek had been, in meaningful part, quietly replenished, month after month, by the exact same transfers that had kept her mortgage current. And whatever's left. The phrase she'd used, casually, warmly, to describe what I could expect, was, when I actually sat with it, almost darkly funny, in a way nobody at that party but me could have understood, because I was, in the most literal financial sense, the entire reason there was anything left at all. Comment the word left right now if you've ever heard your own quiet, invisible effort described back to you as an afterthought. Because that's the exact moment this story turns. I didn't say anything that day. I want to be honest about why, because I think it's the most important decision in this entire story. My mother had just retired. It was her celebration, surrounded by people who loved her, and some part of me. The same part that had kept this arrangement quiet for 11 years, specifically to protect her dignity. Understood that unloading 11 years of invisible financial rescue onto her, in front of extended family, at her own party, would have been an act of retaliation dressed up as honesty. I didn't want that. I never had. So I went home that night, and I did something I'd never actually done in 11 years, despite being a person who checks numbers for a living. I sat down and built a complete, formal accounting of every transfer, month by month, from the very first one 9 months after my father's death through the most recent one, 3 days before this exact party. 132 payments. $182,160. I printed bank statements going back as far as my online records allowed and requested the rest directly from my bank. The way you request records when you finally understand, fully, that you might need to actually show someone the shape of what you've been quietly carrying. I sat with that document for 6 days before I decided what to do with it. Not because I was building towards some dramatic confrontation. I want to be honest that revenge, in the way this genre often frames it, was never really the emotional register I was working in. I was trying to figure out something much simpler and much harder. What did my mother actually deserve to know? And what did I actually need, after 11 years of invisibility, in order to feel like an equal person in my own family rather than a quietly reliable background utility? I called my mother on a Tuesday evening, a week after the party, and I asked if I could come by that weekend to talk about something important. She sounded worried, the specific worry of a mother who's learned, over the years, that something important from her reliable, undramatic daughter usually means something has actually gone wrong somewhere. I told her nothing was wrong. I told her I just needed to show her something. I drove up that Saturday morning and sat with her at the same kitchen table where, 11 years earlier, she'd cried over a stack of red-marked envelopes. I brought the folder. I set it down between us, unopened, the way I imagined my father once set down invoices he needed her to actually look at rather than simply trust him about. "Mom," I said, "I need to show you something, and I need you to just look at it before you say anything, okay?" She nodded, uncertain, and I opened the folder and walked her through it, page by page, the same methodical way I'd have walked a physician through a medication interaction that needed careful, sequential explanation. The first transfer, 9 months after Dad died. The consistent monthly amount. The timing, always 3 days before the mortgage was due. The running total, climbing steadily across 11 years of bank statements until it landed on the final number. "This is what I've sent you," I said. "Every month for 11 years. $182,160. I never told you what it actually was, because I didn't want you to feel like you owed me anything, or like I was keeping score. I wasn't. I want to be really clear about that. I did this because I love you, and because I couldn't stand the idea of you losing this house." My mother's hands were pressed flat against the table, staring at the pages, and I watched something move across her face that I'd genuinely never seen before in 41 years of being her daughter. Not shock exactly, something slower and heavier, the specific expression of a person recalculating an entire decade of their own life in real time. "I thought," she said, finally, her voice unsteady, "I thought your father's pension just. I thought I'd been managing better than I actually was." "You were managing," I said gently. "You just weren't managing alone, and I never let you know that, because I didn't want you to feel like you needed to." I want to tell you what happened next, honestly, because I think it's more complicated and more real than a clean confrontation scene, and I think that complexity is actually the truest part of this whole story. My mother didn't immediately understand the deeper implication, that some of what she'd given Derek, over those same 11 years, had effectively been my money, funneled through her account without either of them ever knowing it. I had to walk her through that part slowly, gently, watching her expression shift again as the second, harder layer of the math finally landed. "The 5,000 for his car," she said quietly. "The money for the brewery. I thought that was coming out of what your father left me." "Some of it probably was," I said. "But not all of it could have been. Not by the numbers. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty, Mom. I'm telling you because at the party, you said Derek's getting the real money, and I get whatever's left. And I need you to actually understand what whatever's left has genuinely meant this whole time, before you make any more decisions about any of it." My mother sat with that for a long time. Long enough that I began to worry I'd made a mistake, that I'd taken something that had been quietly, purely an act of love and turned it, unavoidably, into something that looked like an accusation, however gently I'd tried to frame it. Then she said something I've thought about every day since. "I always thought I was the one holding this family together after your father died," she said. "I think I need to sit with the fact that it might have actually been you the whole time, and I just never let myself see it, because seeing it would have meant admitting how much I needed help." I didn't ask my mother to change her will that day, and I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters for understanding what this story actually is and isn't. I hadn't come to that kitchen table for an inheritance. I'd come because I was tired of being described, casually, warmly, as an afterthought in a story where I'd quietly been the load-bearing wall the whole time. But my mother did change her will, 6 weeks later, entirely on her own initiative, without my asking or even knowing until she called to tell me. She met with an estate attorney and restructured things so the house, free and clear of any further payments, would come to me outright, and what remained of my father's pension savings. After finally, honestly assessing what had actually gone to Derek over the years, would be split with an adjustment reflecting that history, something she described to me, a little shakily, as finally doing the math I should have been doing the whole time. She also, and this is the part I genuinely didn't expect, sat Derek down herself and told him everything. Not to punish him, she was careful to say, but because she'd realized, sitting with what I'd shown her, that keeping him in the dark about where the family's money had actually come from all these years was its own kind of unfairness, a different flavor of the same pattern that had shaped both of us since childhood. Derek called me afterward, and the conversation was awkward and a little raw, but genuine in a way very few conversations between us had ever been. He said, "I had no idea. I think some part of me always figured you were just fine, because you never made anything into a crisis, and crises were the only thing that ever seemed to actually get anyone's attention in our family." That sentence has stayed with me more than almost anything else in this entire story, because I think it names the actual disease underneath everything. Not that my mother didn't love me, not that Derek was malicious, but that our whole family had built an entire economy of attention around difficulty and had simply never developed the instinct to look closely at whatever appeared to be quietly, reliably fine. Here's what I want you to take from this. If you've ever been the reliable one, the easy one, the child whose quiet competence let everyone else stop paying close attention, being easy isn't the same as being unimportant. Sometimes the people holding a family together are the ones nobody thinks to check on, precisely because they've made staying steady look effortless. It isn't effortless. It never was. It's just quiet. Comment the word "left" one more time if you made it all the way to the end. I want to know exactly who stayed with me for this whole story. Subscribe to Pieces of Us. My mother said I'd get whatever was left. She just never knew until the day I finally showed her that I was the reason there was anything left at all.